"Get out of my cockpit." He didn't turn around when he said it. That was the part that stayed with everyone who later heard the story. Captain Thomas Holt, 57 years old, 32 years in the air, a man whose name was spoken with reverence in every crew lounge at Altitude Airlines, delivered those words while staring at his own reflection in the dark glass of the cockpit instrument panel. He saw her the moment she stepped through the door, saw the uniform, the 3 gold stripes, the flight bag, saw her face. And his verdict was in before she took her second step. His fingers paused on the brightness dial he'd been adjusting. His eyes reflected in the glass, didn't soften, didn't question. They simply dismissed. He turned the dial one more notch, looked down at the pre-flight checklist on his iPad and said it again, louder this time, as if the first delivery hadn't been clear enough. "This cockpit runs the way I run it. I decide who sits in that seat. And I'm telling you right now, you don't sit in it. So take your bag, go back to scheduling, and tell them to send me somebody qualified." The Boeing 787 was sitting at Gate 14 of Terminal 4 at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Outside, a gray November morning pressed against the reinforced windows, low clouds, a skin of rain on the tarmac, the kind of wet cold that seeped into everything. It was 7:42 in the morning. Flight 447 to London Heathrow was scheduled to begin boarding at 8:15. 280 passengers were somewhere beyond that jet bridge, clutching their passports, checking departure boards, drinking bad terminal coffee, utterly unaware of what was already unraveling in the cockpit of their plane. What Captain Thomas Holt did not know, could not have imagined even in his worst professional nightmare, was that in exactly 7 minutes, the woman he had just ordered out of his cockpit would fire him, fire his flight attendants, and take command of his aircraft in front of those 280 passengers who would spend the rest of their lives talking about what they witnessed on a rainy Tuesday morning at JFK. Before we get into what happened next, drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you absolutely belonged, this story is for you. Hit subscribe. You won't want to miss how this ends. Now, let's go back. Her name was Diana Hayes. She was 41 years old, and she walked into that cockpit the way she had walked into every cockpit for the last 6 months. Quietly, professionally, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had spent so many years in hostile rooms that she had stopped bracing for them. She was tall, with the kind of posture that didn't announce itself, but held itself. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, precise bun. Her Altitude Airlines first officer uniform fit well. The 3 gold stripes on her epaulets caught the light from the instrument panel for just a moment as she stepped through the door. She set her flight bag down on the floor near the right side stowage compartment. She didn't slam it. She didn't hesitate. She set it down the way a person sets something down when they intend to stay. Her sneakers made no sound on the metal floor. Her face, when Holt finally turned to look at it, was unreadable. Not blank, not afraid, but composed in the particular way of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing exactly when it would come. "Good morning, Captain Holt," she said. "I'm First Officer Diana Hayes. I was assigned to Flight 447 last night at 3:45 a.m. when your previous First Officer called in sick. I've reviewed the flight plan, confirmed the fuel load, and I'm rated on this airframe. I have 4,200 hours on the 787. Shall we start the walk-round?" Holt looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he intends to remove from his day. He was a large man, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with silver hair that he kept combed back in a way that he believed projected authority. His uniform was pressed to a standard that suggested either a very attentive dry cleaner or a man who ironed his own shirts at 5 in the morning. His Rolex, the one he had worn on every flight for 11 years, caught the light on his left wrist when he leaned back in the captain's chair and crossed his arms. He had flown everything. Cargo hoppers in the 90s, regional jets in the early 2000s, wide bodies since 2009. He had been based at JFK for 17 years. His name was on a plaque in the crew lounge. Junior pilots asked him questions they were afraid to ask anyone else. He had logged more transatlantic hours than almost anyone else in the company. He believed without irony and without any awareness that it required belief rather than simply being true that this cockpit was his. Not the airlines, not the passengers, his. And this woman, This woman with her flight bag and her 3 stripes and her calm, unhurried voice had walked into it without asking. "There's been a mistake," he said. "There hasn't been," Diana replied. "Dave Miller is my first officer. Dave Miller is in Queens with a fever of 102. I spoke with crew scheduling at 4 a.m. I was the senior available first officer rated on this aircraft. The assignment is documented." She reached into her jacket and produced her phone, angling the screen toward him. "Would you like to see the confirmation?" Holt didn't look at the phone. He looked at her. The look wasn't angry yet. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who has decided that a thing is beneath his engagement and is only speaking at all because someone needs to be told to leave. "West Coast Hub," he said. "Seattle for the last 3 years. "Right." He turned back to his checklist. "They run things differently over there. I'm sure you've done fine work on domestic routes, but this is transatlantic. Crosswinds over the Atlantic. Complex approaches into Heathrow. I fly with pilots I know, pilots I've worked with. I don't fly with—" He paused, searching for the right word, and the word he chose was the one that changed everything. "With whatever the diversity committee decided to put in my right seat this month." The air in the cockpit went still. Diana looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She tilted her head just slightly, the way a person does when they want to make sure they are hearing correctly. "Are you refusing to fly with me, Captain Holt?" she asked. "I want to be very precise about this." "I'm refusing," he said without looking up from his iPad. "Go tell scheduling to send me a real pilot. I'll wait." "But this plane doesn't move until you're off it." Diana nodded, very slowly. And then something crossed her face. Not triumph, not anger, not hurt. Something quieter and far more dangerous. The look of a chess player who has just watched the other side make the move she needed them to make. "Okay, Captain," she said softly. "I'll make a call." She picked up her flight bag. She turned. She walked out of the cockpit without rushing, without slamming the door, without a single backward glance. Holt leaned back in his chair. He let out a long breath. He reached for the PA handset and clicked it on. "Linda," he said, addressing his head flight attendant, "hold boarding for a few minutes. Crew scheduling issue. Nothing major." He set the handset down, reached for his coffee, which Linda Marsh had placed exactly where he liked it, on the left side of the center console, dark roast, no sugar, and took a slow sip. He had done this before. He had refused to fly with people before. He had always kept his job. He had no idea that the woman who had just walked out of his cockpit was not calling crew scheduling. She was calling the chairman of the board. The jet bridge smelled like rain and jet fuel, and the particular kind of recycled air that lives in the space between a terminal and a plane, neither inside nor outside, neither warm nor cold. Diana Hayes stood at the far end of it near the curve where it connected to the gate, and she held her phone in both hands and looked out through the small rectangular window at the tarmac below. The 787 sat there in the gray morning light, enormous and silver and still. Its engines hadn't turned over yet. Its navigation lights blinked in slow, patient rhythm. She looked at the plane for a moment. Then she opened her contacts and pressed a name. It rang twice. Diana. Paul Whitmore's voice was the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in boardrooms. Unhurried, gravelly, the kind of voice that made whatever room it was in feel slightly smaller. "I thought you'd be wheels up by now." "We have a situation," Diana said. She kept her voice low, even. She described what had happened in the cockpit the way she might read from a report the name, the time, the exact words, the refusal to allow her to sit, the accusation of being a diversity hire, the instruction to get off his plane. She spoke for approximately 90 seconds. She did not editorialize. She did not say how it felt. There was a silence on the other end. "He said that to you?" Whitmore said. "It wasn't a question." "He did. He doesn't know who you are. He sees a uniform and a face he doesn't respect. That's all he knows." Another silence. Whitmore was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, which was one of the reasons Diana trusted him. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to go back on that plane," Diana said. "Send Novello." James Novello was Altitude Airlines' chief legal counsel, a compact, precise man who carried a briefcase that always seemed to contain exactly the document the situation required. I want him at the gate in 20 minutes with my full credentials file and the incorporation documents. Done. He's 20 minutes out from the airport. What else? Have the system team on standby. When I give the word, I need executive override capability. Badge lockouts, roster updates, the crew management screen. Whitmore paused. You want to do this in front of the passengers? It wasn't quite a question. I want to do it correctly, Diana said. However that looks. Understood. She heard him moving, talking to someone in the room with him, the brief, controlled urgency of a man activating something. Diana, he did this in front of how many people? 280 boarding passengers, 4 crew members. At least 6 phones recording when I walked out. A short silence. Okay, Whitmore said. I'll be watching. She ended the call, immediately dialed a second number. James. JFK, Terminal 4, Gate 14. Right now. Bring the CEO credential file, my pilot license documentation file, and the original ownership transfer papers. And James, the notarized copies, not the working set. A beat. I'll be there in 18 minutes. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked out the window at her plane for one more moment. The engines were still cold. The boarding light was still on. Somewhere inside that aircraft, Thomas Holt was sitting in his captain's chair, drinking his coffee, certain that the silence meant he was winning. He had misread the silence completely. Diana walked back to the gate desk. Marco Reyes looked up from his station. Diana approached him and said clearly, and at a volume that carried to the several passengers standing nearby in the boarding queue, I need to confirm on the record, is Captain Holt still preventing a certified first officer from taking her officially assigned position on this flight? Marco looked at his terminal screen. His expression was professionally neutral. That appears to be the ongoing situation, ma'am, and boarding has continued at his request. Yes. Please log this exchange with a timestamp. Marco typed. Several passengers in the queue were looking at her now. A woman in her 40s, business carry-on at her feet, was holding her phone at a slight angle that suggested she was recording. A young man in a college sweatshirt had stopped scrolling. Diana nodded once. Then she picked up her flight bag and walked back down the jet bridge. She came through the cabin door and every head in the cabin turned. There were now perhaps 200 passengers in their seats with the last wave still streaming through the door. The forward section felt like a theater in the moments before a performance begins, that particular quality of attention where everyone is watching the same space and waiting for the same thing. Holt was standing at the front of the aisle. He had the PA microphone still in his hand, though he hadn't used it in the last several minutes. He had been talking to Linda Marsh, who had positioned herself near the galley curtain and was holding her clipboard like a shield. When Diana walked in, Holt's expression did something complicated. The red in his face deepened. I told you, he said. I know what you told me, Diana said. She moved past the forward galley toward the cockpit door. Not toward her seat, just toward the cockpit door. Standing near it. Present. I'm the assigned first officer on this flight. I am not leaving my post. If you want to delay departure further, that decision is yours to make and yours to document. Eric Morrow's phone was still live. Viewer count, 11,400. The comments were moving too fast to follow individually, but the shape of them was clear. Anger, disbelief, support for the woman in the uniform. Holt stepped toward her. You planned this, he said, lower now, less for the cabin and more for her. You wanted this to be public. This is a stunt. Captain Holt, Diana said. I wanted to fly the plane. A passenger 3 rows back, a woman in her 60s named Harriet Bowman, who had been watching the entire situation with her reading glasses on and her hands folded in her lap, said at a perfectly conversational volume that nonetheless carried in the quiet cabin, She's right, you know. Holt turned toward the voice, then back to Diana. Ladies and gentlemen. He raised the microphone again. His voice, amplified through the cabin speakers, had regained its authority, or was trying to. I want you to understand what you're watching. This first officer has been asked to leave. She has refused. The delay is her responsibility. When you miss your connections, and your meetings, and your nights in London, that is the decision she made. He looked at her, expectant, certain that the collective pressure of 280 passengers wanting to get on with their travel would do what his authority alone had failed to do. The cabin was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then, Sofia Garza stepped forward again. She came from her position near row 4, moving to the center of the aisle, and she said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the flat, clean clarity of a statement made for the record, "For the second time this morning, I want to note that this first officer has valid credentials, a verified assignment, and every right to be on this flight. For the second time, I'm saying so." She looked at Holt directly. "And for the second time, I understand that saying so may cost me my job." A man in 7A began to applaud, then stopped uncertain. Then a woman in 9C joined him briefly, and a few others, and then it subsided into the careful quiet of people who wanted to say something and didn't know exactly what. How would you have responded if you were on this flight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. And if this story has you on the edge of your seat, go ahead and subscribe right now. We have more stories like this coming every week. She had been standing in the gate area for 4 minutes when she made the second call of the morning. Not crew scheduling, not HR, not the regional manager. She pressed the name at the very top of her contacts, Paul Whitmore, chairman of the board. But in the 3 seconds before the call connected, 3 seconds in which she stood very still beside the window of the gate area, looking out at the 787 sitting on the wet tarmac below, something happened that always happened in moments like this. The present loosened its hold on her just slightly, and she was somewhere else. She was 9 years old. She was sitting in the left seat of a Cessna 182 at a small general aviation airport outside Newark, New Jersey, and the smell of jet fuel and old leather and something faintly electrical was so thick she could taste it in the back of her throat. The seat was too big for her. Her feet didn't reach the rudder pedals. Her father had tucked a folded blanket under her to give her another 3 inches of height. Robert Hayes was 44 years old then. He was a tall man who moved through the world with deliberate economy, every gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. He had built Altitude Airlines from a single leased turboprop and a route between Newark and Baltimore, and he had done it over 23 years, and the doing of it had left marks on him. A slight graying at the temples earlier than nature intended, laugh lines that ran deep, and a particular quality of attention. The sense when he looked at you that he was actually looking. He put his hands over Diana's on the yoke, not controlling it, just resting there. "Feel that," he said. "It's shaking," she said. "That's the plane talking to you. Every aircraft has its own voice. This one's a little nervous in crosswinds. You learn to listen." He let go, left her hands there alone. That's what makes a pilot. Not the hours, not the certifications, the listening. She sat very still in the big seat, hands on the vibrating yoke, watching the runway stretch out ahead of them through the windscreen. "Dad," she said, "can I actually fly it?" He looked at her with those eyes that were always either laughing or thinking and said, "You already are." She looked down at her hands, then out the window, then back at him. "They'll tell you this seat isn't for you," he said, and his voice had changed, quieter, more serious. The voice he used when he was saying something he needed her to remember. "My whole life people told me the same thing. I wanted to fly, they said. You're not the type. I wanted to build an airline, they said. People like you don't do that. Every room I walked into, somebody had already decided I didn't belong there." He paused. "You know what I did?" "What?" He smiled. "I bought the room." She was 26 years old. She was sitting in a hotel lobby in Houston after the 3rd interview of the day, and her hands were wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, and she was not going to cry. She had decided before she walked out of the building that she was not going to cry, and she was keeping that decision, even though her chest felt like something had been removed from it. The interview panel had been 4 men, all white, all 50-something, all wearing the same expression of courteous assessment that she had learned over the preceding year of applying to regional carriers to read like a weather system. She had answered every technical question correctly. She knew this because she had studied for 6 months and could recite procedures in her sleep. She had passed the simulator evaluation. She had passed the background check and the physical. The last interviewer, a man named Gerald something with a gold watch and a habit of clicking his pen, had looked at her file and then looked at her and said, "Miss Hayes, do you think you can handle the pressure of a cockpit environment? We find that certain candidates struggle with the dynamic." She had looked at Gerald something and said, "I've logged 800 hours. I hold an ATP certificate. My simulator scores were in the top 5% of all candidates this cycle. What dynamic are you referring to?" Gerald had smiled the smile of a man who considers composure a confirmation of his concern rather than a counter-argument to it. She had not been offered the position. That night, her father called. "How'd it go?" he asked. She told him. There was a long silence. Robert Hayes was not a man who rushed to fill silences. "Good," he said finally. She blinked. "Good. Now you know what you're dealing with. You can't fight what you can't see." A pause. "What are you going to do tomorrow?" She thought about it. "Book a sim session," she said. "I want to work on crosswind landings." He laughed. It was a short, warm sound. "That's my girl." She had not cried. She booked a sim session. She logged 600 more hours over the next 18 months. She was hired by a different carrier. She flew for 12 years, built a record, earned a reputation. And then her father had gotten sick, and everything had shifted. She was 39 years old, and it was the last real conversation she had with him. He was in a hospital room at a facility in New Jersey, and the afternoon light was coming through the blinds in narrow strips, and his hands on the blanket were thinner than she had ever seen them. She sat in the chair beside the bed and held one of those hands and didn't say anything for a while. Because sometimes silence is the most honest response. "The company is yours when I'm gone," Robert said. His voice was thinner, too, but the quality of attention in his eyes hadn't changed at all. He was still looking at her the way he always looked at her, like she was the most important person in the room, which was what she realized only now had always been true. "But it's sick, Diana. The culture. I couldn't see it from where I sat. When I walked into a room, people straightened up. They used their best manners. They hid what they were." He paused to breathe. "You need to go in without the title. See it from the inside. Find the rot." "I will," she said. "Don't just manage it from the office," he said. "Put on the uniform, fly the routes, talk to the crews. You'll know." Another pause. "Your mother always said you listened better than anyone." Diana looked at his hand in hers, his pilot's hands, strong even now, even thinner, even here. "I learned from you," she said. He closed his eyes. He was quiet for a while, and she thought he might be sleeping. Then he said very softly, "You always could hear what the plane was saying." She squeezed his hand. He died 11 days later. She spent 2 weeks handling the estate and the board transition and the legal transfer of ownership. Then she put on a first officer's uniform, used her legal name, listed her actual pilot credentials, and reported to the New York crew base for line assignment. She had been flying for 8 months. She had met pilots who were extraordinary. She had met crews who were professional and kind and deeply committed to the passengers in their care. And she had been building a file. The phone was ringing in her hand. Diana came back to the gate area, to the rain-streaked window, the noise of the terminal, the gate agent's radio crackling nearby, and Whitmore picked up on the second ring. "Diana, I thought you'd be wheels up." "We have a situation," she said. Paul Whitmore listened without interrupting. This was one of his better qualities. When Diana finished, he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, the length of time it took him to make a decision he had already made before she'd finished speaking. "He doesn't know," Whitmore said. "He sees a uniform and a face he doesn't respect," Diana said. "That's all he sees. I can have him removed in 10 minutes. Airport Authority Company Security." Not yet. Diana was watching the boarding stream through the gate windows. Passengers still moving. Holt still in there. "Send Novello. I want him here with the full credential package. CEO documentation, the ownership transfer filing, my original pilot license history. Everything. I'll pull him off the conference call he's on right now. Anything else? Have the system team on standby. When I give the word, I need executive override capability. Badge lockouts, roster updates, the crew management screen." Whitmore paused. "You want to do this in front of the passengers?" It wasn't quite a question. "I want to do it correctly," Diana said. "However that looks." Understood. She heard him moving, talking to someone in the room with him, the brief, controlled urgency of a man activating something. "Diana, he did this in front of how many people?" 280 boarding passengers, 4 crew members. At least 6 phones recording when I walked out. A short silence. "Okay," Whitmore said. "I'll be watching." She ended the call and dialed Novello. "James, Terminal 4, Gate 14, JFK. Right now. Bring the CEO credential file, my pilot license documentation file, and the original ownership transfer papers. And James, the notarized copies, not the working set." 18 minutes, Novello said immediately. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked out the window at her plane for one more moment. The engines were still cold. The boarding light was still on. Somewhere inside that aircraft, Thomas Holt was sitting in his captain's chair drinking his coffee, certain that the silence meant he was winning. He had misread the silence completely. Diana walked back to the gate desk and gave Marco Reyes the instruction to log everything with a timestamp. Then she walked back down the jet bridge. At 8:31 a.m., Eric Morrow's viewer count crossed 31,000. He had positioned his phone against the headrest of seat 2D, braced at an angle that kept the forward aisle in frame, and he was simultaneously watching the stream and watching the real room with the slightly surreal doubling of a person who exists in both at once. The comments were coming so fast they moved like a river, not individual words but a current, and the current was unanimous. "She is so calm. Fire him. She's still just standing there. Somebody tell me who she is. This pilot is unhinged. Altitude Airlines just lost a customer. No, 100 customers. Who is she?" That last question was appearing again and again in different forms from different accounts. Claire Santos had posted 3 clips. The third one, the one with the word brochure, had been picked up by 2 travel accounts with large followings and was spreading in the way that things spread when they are both outrageous and completely uncomplicatedly clear, when there is no ambiguity about what was said or what it meant. Claire typed the caption on a 4th clip, this one showing Sofia Garza's second intervention, her voice steady, her hands at her sides. And she thought for a moment about what to write. She had been doing this long enough to know that the right caption was not the most dramatic one, but the most accurate one. She wrote, "The young flight attendant has spoken up twice. She's been threatened with her job both times. She hasn't moved." Within 90 seconds, 47,000 impressions. In row 5, a woman named Grace Tillman, 68 years old, retired school administrator, on her way to visit her daughter in London for the first time in 2 years, had been watching the whole situation with her hands folded in her lap and her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She had not taken out her phone. She didn't have a social media account. But she had spent 30 years managing a school district, which meant she had spent 30 years watching authority figures decide which people they could afford to dismiss. She recognized the pattern. She turned to the woman in 5A beside her, a stranger, late 30s, clearly a frequent traveler, and said quietly, "I've seen this before. Just never on a plane." The woman in 5A looked at her. "I've seen it everywhere," she said. "She's handling it beautifully." "She is," Grace Tillman agreed. "It takes a long time to get that good at it." Holt had gone quiet. This was, in some ways, more unsettling than when he had been talking. He was standing near the front of the cabin, microphone at his side, looking at the passengers with the expression of a man who has just realized that the room he entered expecting to perform in has become a room that is performing for him. Studying him, recording him, circulating him to 31,000 people who had never heard his name before this morning. He looked at Linda Marsh. Linda was standing by the galley curtain with her clipboard, and for the first time in 6 years of flying with Thomas Holt, she was not looking at him. She was looking at Diana. Diana was standing near the cockpit door, and she was doing essentially nothing. She was not performing for the cameras. She was not delivering speeches. She was standing with her hands at her sides, and her face composed, and her eyes on the middle distance. And she was waiting. And the waiting itself had become the most eloquent thing in the room. A passenger in 8C raised his hand. "Excuse me, is there anyone in charge who can explain what's actually happening?" Holt turned toward him. I am in charge. What's happening is that scheduling made an error and the assignment was confirmed at 3:45 this morning, said Marco Reyes, who had walked down the jet bridge and was now standing at the forward door. His voice was matter-of-fact and absolute. He was looking at his tablet. First Officer Hayes was the senior available rated pilot. The assignment is clean. I have the documentation here if you'd like to review it. Holt turned to look at him. Marco met his gaze without expression. I don't need a gate agent, Holt began. He's not just a gate agent, Diana said quietly. She hadn't moved from her position near the cockpit door. He's the operational supervisor for this terminal, and he just gave you documented confirmation that I belong on this flight. She paused. That's now on the record. Eric Morrow's viewer count, 47,000. The hashtag Flight 447 had reached the trending list, number 3 nationally and climbing. Claire Santos looked up from her phone long enough to register what she was actually seeing. A woman standing completely still in the middle of a storm that was organizing itself around her. Not fighting the storm, but simply declining to be moved by it. I don't know who she is, she said to no one in particular. Neither do I, said the man in 4A. I don't think that's the point, said Grace Tillman from row 5. At the forward door, James Novello had opened his briefcase. He removed a document and set it on top of the stack. A single sheet, the notarized certification of ownership transfer with the Altitude Airlines corporate seal embossed in the upper left corner. He set it on the armrest of the nearest forward seat without ceremony and turned to Diana. He was ready. Diana looked at him, looked at Holt. And then the screens changed. The flight information monitors, the slim panels embedded in the overhead bins at regular intervals through the cabin, flickered. A system update triggered from Altitude Airlines headquarters rolled through the aircraft's internal network. The screens refreshed. The route information stayed. The departure time changed to delayed, and the crew listing, which almost no one ever read, updated in the bottom corner of the display, Captain D. Hayes. In 7C, a college student noticed it first. Wait, he said. Then louder. Wait, look at the screen. Heads turned upward. Not everyone could read it from every seat, but enough could. And Eric Morrow's camera swung upward and caught it in frame, and in the live stream comments, the reaction hit like a wave breaking. Captain Hayes, did the screen just... Wait, what? Oh, she's the captain. Holt's eyes traveled up to the nearest monitor. He read it. He read it again. Diana Hayes watched him read it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The system had spoken first, not with drama, but with documentation. Not with an announcement, but with a fact. What is this? Holt said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man's world rearranging itself around him. That's the crew roster, Novello said pleasantly from the doorway. Updated about 40 seconds ago. That's not... Holt's voice caught. He looked at Diana. You manipulated the system. You staged this. You hid who you were and you... Captain Holt, Diana said. He stopped. Your access badge, she said. Check it. He looked down at the badge clipped to his chest. The small LED indicator, usually a steady green, was blinking red. He walked to the cockpit door, reached for his badge, held it to the reader. The door did not open. The cabin was completely, utterly breathing, suspended, silent. The cockpit door didn't open. It was a small thing, a locked door, a beep, a red light, and yet the effect it produced in the cabin of Flight 447 was so immediate and so total that passengers who later tried to describe it said the same thing. It felt like the air pressure changed, like something physical had shifted. Like the entire architecture of the last 45 minutes had reorganized itself around a single point. Thomas Holt held his badge to the reader a second time, then a third. Red, red, red. He pulled the badge off its clip and looked at it, held it up, turned it over, looked at the LED on the front face, as if proximity might convince it to change. It blinked its red rhythm at him, patient and completely indifferent to what he needed it to do. There's a malfunction, he said. His voice had changed. Not broken, not yet, but thinner. The confidence in it drained of some essential substance. "The system is functioning correctly," Novello said. He had moved from the doorway into the forward aisle. The access restriction was applied remotely at 8:29 a.m. on authorization from the chairman of the board. "It was applied to your credentials specifically, Captain Holt." Holt stared at him. "Who are you?" "James Novello. I'm the chief legal counsel for Altitude Airlines." He said it the way you state a fact, without weight, without drama. Then he picked up the document on top of his stack and held it so that Holt could see the corporate seal. "And I'm here to facilitate a transition of command authority on this aircraft." Holt looked at the document. He looked at Novello. He looked at Diana still standing by the cockpit door, by the door that had opened for her badge and would not open for his. "This is not," he started. "Captain." Diana's voice was quiet. "Your badge to the reader, please. One more time." Holt looked at her. He didn't move. "Try it," she said. "Not a challenge, just a suggestion." He held the badge to the reader. Read. The door to the cockpit that Thomas Holt had called his kingdom for 11 years stayed closed. He took a step back. He was a large man and the step was small, but it was a step back and something about it, the involuntary retreat of a body that had registered something the mind had not yet caught up to, was visible to everyone in the forward cabin. Derek Walsh, who had been near the rear galley trying to make himself invisible, looked up. He saw Holt stepping back from the cockpit door. He saw the red badge light. He looked at his own badge clipped to his breast pocket and then didn't reach for it. Something about the moment told him not to. Sofia Garza reached for hers, held it up. Green. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Not relief, exactly, but the quiet recognition that she was on the right side of something. Linda Marsh didn't reach for hers at all. Eric Morrow's phone caught everything. His camera panned from Holt's face to the badge in his hand, to the red reader on the cockpit door, to Diana standing beside it, and then to the overhead monitor, which still read Captain D. Hayes. And somewhere in that pan viewer, count crossed 64,000. Holt's voice, when it came, was different from anything the cabin had heard from him all morning. The authority was still there. The 32 years of command, the certainty that he was right, but it was threaded through now with something harder to place. Not quite panic. Something more like the beginning of the understanding that the room he was in was no longer the room he thought it was. "You engineered this," he said to Diana. "You set this up. You came in here knowing. You knew what you were going to do. You hid who you were and you waited for me to—" "I walked onto this aircraft," Diana said as a first officer with a confirmed assignment. "I gave you my credentials. I told you I was rated on this aircraft. I asked you to start the pre-flight." She paused. "What happened next was your choice. You didn't tell me who you were." "I told you exactly who I was. You decided it wasn't enough." She looked at him steadily. "The question of who I am in addition to that, that's what you're about to find out." In the overhead monitors, the screen updated again. This time, it wasn't just the crew roster. The full company logo appeared. The Altitude Airlines mark, a stylized horizon line that Robert Hayes had designed himself. And beneath it, in the calm font of an official company communication, a single line. Executive Authority, D. Hayes, Altitude Airlines. This was the moment that stopped the cabin cold. A woman in row 7 said, "Oh my God." A man in row 3 said, "Wait." Grace Tillman in row 5 put her reading glasses up. She looked at the screen. She looked at Diana. She sat back in her seat and folded her hands in her lap and said very quietly to no one in particular, "There it is." Eric Morrow's viewer count, 91,000. Holt was looking at the monitor, looking at the logo, looking at the words. His jaw was working slightly, not speaking, not chewing, just moving the way a jaw moves when the mind behind it is trying to process a thing that doesn't fit the shape of the world as it has always been understood. He turned to Novello. "Call Paul Whitmore," he said. "Get Paul Whitmore on the phone. Tell him what's happening here. He'll clear this up." Novello looked at him with an expression of perfect professional neutrality. "Mr. Whitmore is aware of the situation. He authorized the badge lockout approximately 12 minutes ago." Holt went very still. "He authorized—" He stopped, looked at Diana. Something in his face completed a calculation it had been refusing to run all morning. "Who are you?" he said. And this time it was different from all the other times he had said or implied it. This time the word "who" wasn't a dismissal. It was an actual question. Diana Hayes looked at Thomas Holt, at this man who had spent 32 years in the left seat of every aircraft this airline flew, who had been backed up and covered for, and enabled and deferred to until the backing and covering and deference had calcified into his bones, who had looked at her in this cockpit this morning and seen something that wasn't there, and refused to see what was. And she said quietly and clearly, "I'm the pilot you told to get off your plane." She stepped to the cockpit door. She held her badge to the reader, green. The door opened. The cockpit that Thomas Holt had called his kingdom for 11 years stood open in front of him, and the woman he had dismissed was standing in its threshold, one hand on the frame looking back at him, not with triumph, not with contempt, but with the absolute grounded, unshakable calm of someone who had always belonged in that room and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. She stepped back from the cockpit threshold. Not away from it, just back into the cabin where the audience was, where the record was being made. Diana reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a phone. She held it at her side, screen up, and pressed a single button. The speaker engaged. "Paul," she said. Paul Whitmore's voice filled the forward cabin. Not loud, but clear, carrying the particular authority of a voice that had spent 40 years in rooms where decisions were made and had never once needed to shout. Diana Whitmore said, "I've been watching. The board is convened remotely. What do you need?" The cabin absorbed this in silence. Thomas Holt was looking at the phone. He knew that voice. He had shaken that hand at the annual company dinner every year for a decade. He had sat in rooms where Paul Whitmore sat. He knew exactly what the presence of that voice on Diana Hayes's phone in this context, at this moment, meant. And the knowing of it moved through him like cold water. "I need confirmation of authority to proceed," Diana said. "You have it," Whitmore said. "Full executive authority. The board is on record." "Thank you, Paul." She ended the call. The cabin waited. Diana put the phone back in her pocket. She smoothed the front of her uniform jacket. One hand, once the way you smooth something you're about to do something formal in. Then she looked at Thomas Holt. "My name," she said, "is Diana Hayes. I have been flying as a first officer on Altitude Airlines routes for the last 6 months under my legal name and my actual pilot credentials, in order to understand what this company looks like from inside a uniform." She paused. "What I found, what you showed me this morning, Captain Holt, in the clearest possible terms, is exactly what I came to find." She reached into the same interior pocket and produced a card. Not a pilot credential, a platinum black card with the Altitude Airlines mark on it, and a name on it, and a title on it. She held it up. "I am the owner and chief executive officer of Altitude Airlines. My father, Robert Hayes, founded this company 37 years ago and left it to me 18 months ago. I have been its CEO for every one of those 18 months, including the 6 months during which you have worked for me without knowing it." She looked at him. "And I am terminating your employment effective immediately." The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture. Dense, pressurized, the silence of 280 people who have just had their understanding of the last hour reorganized completely, and are still in the process of that reorganization. Thomas Holt's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "That's not—" He stopped. The color in his face had gone from red to something paler, something uneven, like a fire burning unevenly at its edges. "That's—" He looked at Novello, at the corporate logo on the overhead monitor. "You hid who you were," he said. "That's entrapment. You can't— This isn't legal. I have rights. I have 32 years. "You have 32 years on your record," Diana said, "and you have this morning on your record as well. Both will be part of the documentation." She looked at him steadily. "You told me I didn't belong on your plane. You physically blocked my seat. You told 280 passengers that I was a publicity decision, not a pilot. You made that choice in public, on the record, in front of 6 dozen cameras." She paused. I'm making this choice in the same place. James Novello had opened his briefcase fully and was preparing the termination documentation. His pen moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled crises before and understood that the documentation was the thing that outlasted the moment. Holt looked around the cabin. He had wanted witnesses. He had the witnesses. They were just looking at him differently than he had planned. A man in 6A was shaking his head slowly. A woman in 3C had both hands pressed to her mouth. The college student in 12B was looking at his phone's screen at the comments at the number of people watching and then at Holt. And the expression on his face was not hostility. It was the pure, uncomplicated disbelief of someone witnessing something they will remember exactly for the rest of their life. "You set me up," Holt said. "Not to Diana now, just to the air." "I gave you the exact same situation I give every employee I work with," Diana said. "I was a first officer with valid credentials and a confirmed assignment. You saw something that wasn't there and refused to see what was. Everything that followed was your decision. All of it." Holt's shoulders dropped. Not completely, not collapse, not surrender, but a degree, a perceptible degree, like a structure giving up a small portion of its load. "I've been here 32 years, he said, and his voice had gone quiet, and the quietness of it was different from Diana's quietness. Hers was controlled and chosen. His was the quiet of something deflating. "My record is clean. You can't, for one bad morning." "Your record," Diana said, "is why we need to have a longer conversation. That conversation will happen with HR and legal counsel." She looked at Novello. "But the command decision happens here." She turned to face the cabin. Linda Marsh. Linda, by the galley curtain, looked up. Her clipboard was against her chest. She looked like someone who had known this moment was coming and had hoped fiercely to be wrong about it. "You've flown with Captain Holt for 6 years, Diana said. "I've seen your HR file. I know you filed 3 internal complaints about his conduct in those 6 years. All 3 were dismissed before they reached any formal review." She paused. "You've also had 6 years of opportunities to do what Sofia Garza did this morning. Today, when it was in front of you again, you chose to say nothing." Linda's eyes went to the floor. "He's the captain," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "Yes," Diana said, "and you chose his authority over your own conscience and over the dignity of a colleague for 6 years." She looked at her for a long moment. "I'm placing you on suspension pending a full ethics investigation. Whether that becomes something permanent depends entirely on what that investigation shows." She paused. "Including what it shows about those 3 complaints and why they were dismissed." Linda's badge made a sound. The LED shifted from green to amber. Not red, amber. She looked down at it. "Step aside, please." Linda Marsh stepped aside. Diana looked at Derek Walsh, who was in the rear galley and had been hoping apparently to be invisible enough to escape notice. "Derek Walsh," she said. "Same finding, same process. Suspension pending investigation." Derek nodded once. He didn't speak. His badge went amber. Diana turned toward the galley where Sofia Garza was standing. Sofia was the only crew member in the forward section who had not moved during the last several minutes. She was standing with her hands at her sides and her back straight and her chin up, and she was looking at Diana with an expression that was neither expectant nor afraid. It was the expression of someone who has decided to be present for whatever comes next, and to receive it without flinching. Diana looked at her for a moment. "Sofia Garza," she said. Sofia held very still. "You spoke up twice this morning," Diana said. "You were threatened with your job the first time. You came back for the second. You told the truth when no one else would." She paused. "As of today, you are promoted to senior cabin crew on the transatlantic route permanently assigned. You'll have the formal letter by tomorrow morning." For exactly 2 seconds, Sofia didn't react. Then something crossed her face. Not relief, not triumph, just a kind of fullness, a brimming quality, like a vessel that has been filled past the point it expected to hold. She said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely a voice at all. Then she straightened up again, and her hands were still at her sides, and her back was still straight, and she was still there. In row 5, Grace Tillman began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, the way you clap when you mean something. A man in row 7 joined her, then a woman in row 4, then others cascading through the cabin, not with the enthusiasm of a crowd at a concert, but with the gravity of people who are acknowledging something real. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It felt longer. Eric Morrow's viewer count, 183,000. Holt, meanwhile, had not moved. He was standing in the center aisle, holding his badge in one hand, no longer a captain, and not yet sure what he was instead. And the walk out of this cabin was in front of him, like something he had to get through. Diana looked at him. "You'll want to collect your personal belongings from the crew room," she said. "Security will meet you at the gate to facilitate the process." She paused. "You can go through the cabin or through the jet bridge. Your choice." Holt looked at the jet bridge door, then at the cabin, at the 280 passengers and their phones, at the faces that weren't angry, but were something more uncomfortable than anger witnesses. He chose the cabin. He walked, and no one said anything. No one booed, no one cheered, no one reached out. They just watched him go, which was its own kind of verdict. The verdict of people who have seen something clearly and are letting the seeing be enough. One person, the woman in 4B whose name no one caught, put her hand briefly on his arm as he passed her row. Not in comfort, just a touch. The way you might touch the shoulder of someone who has just done something they won't be able to undo. Holt walked out. The jet bridge door closed behind him. The cabin breathed. Diana walked to the cockpit door. She held her badge to the reader. Green. She stepped inside and sat down in the left seat, the captain's seat, the seat that was hers, that had always been hers, that she was sitting in for the first time this morning, not as a quiet observer of what was broken, but as the person responsible for fixing it. She put her hands on the yoke. The 787 was still cold, still silent, still waiting. She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and in that second she heard her father's voice very clearly from 32 years ago from the left seat of a Cessna 182 on a runway in New Jersey. Feel that. The plane talks to you through your hands. If you listen, really listen, it tells you everything. She opened her eyes. She keyed the intercom. "This is Captain Diana Hayes," she said, her voice coming through the cabin speakers, clear and steady and warm. "On behalf of Altitude Airlines, I want to sincerely apologize for this morning. What you witnessed was unacceptable, and the steps to ensure it does not happen again begin right now. We will be departing as soon as the replacement crew is in place, and I'll be in the left seat for this flight, personally." She paused. "Drinks are on the house. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for staying." The cabin responded with applause that was warmer this time, less solemn, more released. The sound of people who had been holding something and were now putting it down. Sofia Garza stood in the aisle and smiled. Altitude Airlines Flight 447 departed JFK at 11:51 a.m., 2 hours and 6 minutes behind schedule. It landed at London Heathrow 14 minutes ahead of its revised arrival time because Diana Hayes flew it the way she flew everything, efficiently, precisely, without drama. The cabin was quieter on the flight than most transatlantic crossings tend to be. Not subdued, still. People ate their meals and watched their films and looked out at the dark Atlantic below with the contemplative energy of passengers who had boarded something other than just a flight that morning. Several of them wrote things in their notes apps. Several others simply sat and thought. Eric Morrow ended his live stream shortly after departure, having accumulated a peak viewer count of 212,000. The recorded footage was subsequently viewed on various platforms by approximately 47 million people over the following 10 days. He was not prepared for this. He later described it in an interview as accidentally documenting the most significant 6 hours of his working life. Claire Santos's photo thread accumulated 340,000 shares. The single image that spread furthest was one she had captured in the moment after Sofia Garza's second intervention. Sofia, standing in the aisle, hands at her sides, looking at Holt. A photograph that appeared on the front page of a newspaper above the fold with a caption that said simply, "She stayed." At Terminal 4, Thomas Holt sat on a plastic chair near the baggage claim entrance of the arrivals hall, outside the secure zone because his credentials had been revoked and he couldn't get back in, and watched himself on the CNN ticker scrolling above the heads of travelers who had no idea who he was. The ticker read, Altitude Airlines CEO flies own route undercover. Fires captain who refused her as co-pilot. He called Raymond Novak, the regional representative for the pilots' union, from that plastic chair. Novak listened. Then said Thomas, I've seen 3 of the videos. It was taken out of context, Holt said. You called her a brochure, Novak said, on a live stream. With 200,000 people watching. The stream was unauthorized. The passengers had no right to… Thomas. Novak's voice was the voice of a man deciding something. I'll make some calls. But you need a lawyer. Not the union. A real lawyer. Holt called a lawyer named Marcus Gould, known in airline circles for the particular combination of aggression and technical knowledge that made him effective and unpleasant in equal measure. I saw the footage, Gould said when Holt had explained the situation. I want to sue for wrongful termination, Holt said. 40 million. Entrapment. Privacy violation. Defamation of character. Gould was quiet for a moment. The entrapment angle has some legs, he said. CEO using a hidden identity to investigate employees. There's an argument there. Bring me everything. Come to my office tomorrow morning. Holt sat in the airport chair and felt for the first time since that morning something that wasn't quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood. He didn't know sitting there that Diana Hayes had already requested a forensic audit of his flight records. The lawsuit landed on Diana's desk on a Tuesday, a 43-page document with Gould's name on the letterhead and Thomas Holt's name at the top, and a demand of $40 million at the bottom, with a list of claims that included wrongful termination, entrapment, invasion of privacy, and defamation of character. Diana read it once, set it down, picked up the phone. James, she said. The lawsuit is here. I've seen it, Novello said. He was already in her office. Gould is good. He knows aviation law, and he knows employment law, and he knows how to run a thing in the press while running it in court. The entrapment argument is weak on the merits, but strong in the media cycle. He's also threatening to release information about company practices if we don't settle, Diana said. He mentioned the maintenance deferral audits from 2019, Novello said. Holt apparently has files. He's been with the company long enough to have accumulated a considerable amount of institutional knowledge. He's been here 32 years, Diana said. Right. And for 32 years he's had access to how things were done, including things that were done badly. Diana looked at the lawsuit on her desk, then at Novello. I want a forensic audit of the maintenance records. Of Holt's records. Everything. His flight logs for the last 10 years. Cross-referenced with fuel purchase orders, maintenance sign-offs he was involved in, and the passenger complaint database. She paused. And I want Carl Brody's files. Novello looked at her. Brody retired 2 years ago. He did, Diana said, and he was our chief legal counsel for 12 years before that. Pull everything. What are you looking for? The reason Thomas Holt felt untouchable, Diana said. Men like him don't act that way in a vacuum. They act that way because something behind them has always held the door open. The audit team worked for 4 days. They were thorough. They were also on the 3rd day very quiet in a way that made the investigators around them slightly uneasy. The quietness of people who have found something they expected to find and are now determining exactly how large it is. On the 4th day, Novello came to Diana's office at 7:30 in the morning and closed the door and sat down across from her desk and placed a single manila folder in front of her without preamble. You were right, he said. She opened the folder. The contents were not on their surface spectacular. They were receipts, email chains, interoffice memos with dates and reference numbers, and the kind of dry administrative language that conceals things rather than revealing them, unless you know what to look for. And Diana had been an executive long enough to know. Thomas Holt, over the course of the last 7 years, had been a reliable beneficiary of Carl Brody's willingness to reclassify and suppress complaints. 14 formal passenger complaints about conduct on Holt's flights, incidents involving dismissive or discriminatory treatment of passengers, had been routed through Brody's office during his tenure as chief legal counsel and reclassified as operational service disputes, a categorization that removed them from the HR and conduct review process entirely. This would have been a significant finding on its own. But there was more. Brody didn't do this as a favor, Novello said. There's a paper trail. Holt had access to internal safety data from his union rep committee seat. Specifically, data about maintenance deferral decisions on the Airbus fleet. Decisions that had been made correctly but documented in a way that could be made to look otherwise if presented selectively. Novello paused. He shared that data with Brody. Brody used it as leverage in 2 employment disputes where he had a private financial stake in the outcome. Diana was very still. Brody suppressed Holt's complaints, she said. Holt gave Brody the leverage he needed to benefit privately from employment disputes. That's correct. That's not just suppression, Diana said. That's a mutual arrangement, an exchange of benefit. She looked at the folder. How long have you known something like this existed? I've suspected for 4 months, Novello said. Since 2 former employees contacted me separately with similar accounts. I didn't have documentation until now. Diana closed the folder. She sat back. She looked at the window of her office, the Manhattan skyline, gray and bright at the same time, the way it always was in November. And she thought about her father, who had built this company, and who had known something was wrong in it, and who had spent his last years trying to find it from behind a desk on the 42nd floor, and had eventually understood that the only way to find it was to go inside. He had been right. He had also been right that it was worse than it looked from the outside. Where is Holt right now? She asked. At Gould's office, Novello said. They're expecting our settlement offer today. Diana looked at the folder, then at Novello. Call the car, she said, and call the FAA's enforcement division. Tell them we have documentation we need to share in connection with an ongoing matter. Tell them to meet us at Gould's office. Novello looked at her. Then he nodded once and stood up. Gould's office was on the 22nd floor of a building near the courthouse district. The kind of office that was designed to communicate that the person who occupied it won things. It had bookshelves full of legal precedent, a conference table that could seat 16, and a view of the city that cost $2,000 a square foot to have. Thomas Holt was sitting at that conference table when Diana walked in. He was wearing a new suit. He looked better than he had on the plastic chair at the airport, rested, if not relaxed. He had the posture familiar from the cockpit of a man who believes he is about to be negotiated with. He had brought Gould, and Gould had brought 2 associates, and the 3 of them were arranged on one side of the table with papers and laptops, and the practiced arrangement of people who intended to be difficult. Diana walked in with Novello and 2 FAA enforcement officers. Neatly suited identification visible with the particular efficiency of movement that is specific to federal regulators who have been doing this a long time and have no need to perform it. Holt's eyes went to the federal IDs. His posture changed. Gould stood up. This is a settlement conference, Gould said. You cannot bring federal enforcement personnel into a settlement conference without prior agreement from— Sit down, Marcus, Diana said. Not unkindly. Gould sat. She placed the manila folder on the conference table. She didn't open it. She just put it there, centered between herself and Holt. Captain Holt, she said, I'm going to give you a choice, and I'm going to explain it very clearly. This is important. Holt looked at the folder. He didn't reach for it. Inside this folder is documentation of a 7-year arrangement between you and Carl Brody, Diana said. In that arrangement, 14 formal complaints about your conduct were reclassified and suppressed by Brody. In exchange, you provided Brody with internal company data that he used for personal financial benefit in employment disputes where he had a private stake. She paused. That is not just a conduct violation. Under federal statute, the exchange of proprietary company information for the suppression of formal complaints constitutes fraud. Additionally, Brody's use of that information in employment disputes may constitute a criminal abuse of his fiduciary position. She looked at him steadily. The FAA officers here are aware of the documentation. They are present in an advisory capacity. What happens next depends entirely on the choice you make in the next few minutes. Holt was looking at the folder. His jaw was tight. Gould had gone very still beside him. Option 1, Diana said. You drop the lawsuit today. You sign a full cooperation agreement with our internal investigation and provide complete disclosure about your arrangement with Brody. In exchange, Altitude Airlines does not independently forward this documentation to the Department of Justice. The FAA will conduct its own assessment regardless. We cannot control that. But we will not amplify it. Gould spoke carefully. And option 2. You proceed with the lawsuit, Diana said. We counterfile with everything in this folder plus additional documentation. Our audit team continues to develop. We forward the full file to the DOJ and issue a public statement about its contents. The media coverage that follows your lawsuit will be substantially different from what you are currently planning for. The room was very quiet. Gould leaned toward Holt and spoke quietly. Holt's head moved slightly. Not a nod, not a shake, something in between. You can't prove I knew, Holt said. His voice was quieter than Diana had ever heard it. The authority had drained out of it like water from a broken vessel. I knew Brody handled complaints. I didn't know how. You provided him with internal data, Diana said. The connection between the provision and the suppression is documented. She paused. I don't need you to have understood all of it. I need to demonstrate benefit. The DOJ can establish the rest. Holt looked at his attorney. Gould looked at the folder. Neither of them moved. Diana waited. The particular quality of her waiting, the stillness, the absence of need for the silence to be filled, was the same quality that had held the cockpit of Flight 447 together on a rainy Tuesday morning, while everything around it fell apart. Finally, Holt looked at her, and he asked, for the third time in the third way across the 3 stages of this long and strange morning, that had somehow extended into weeks, Who are you? But this time the question was not dismissal, and not accusation, and not confusion. It was just the sound of a man who had been certain for a very long time, and had finally stopped being certain and was trying to understand the shape of the world now that it had changed. Diana looked at him for a long moment. I'm the pilot you told to get off your plane, she said. She gathered the folder. She stood. She looked at Novello, who nodded. Then she walked out of Marcus Gould's conference room without looking back. 2 days later, the lawsuit was formally withdrawn. Gould's office issued a terse statement citing a mutual decision to resolve the matter outside of the court system. Carl Brody declined to comment on any aspect of the matter through a statement issued by his personal attorney. The FAA conducted its own assessment independently. Its findings, issued 6 weeks later, cited conduct inconsistent with the responsibilities of a licensed flight crew member and revoked Thomas Holt's pilot certificate. He appealed. The appeal was not successful. He never flew again. The first consequence that moved through Altitude Airlines was structural. Within 72 hours of Flight 447, Diana convened the full leadership team and initiated an internal accountability review. Not a press conference, not a memo, but a quiet, floor-by-floor, department-by-department examination of every complaint file that had passed through the legal department in the 12 years of Carl Brody's tenure. The review team identified 31 complaints, 28 involving crew conduct, 3 involving passenger treatment, that had been reclassified or administratively closed without formal investigation. All 31 were reopened. The people who had filed them were contacted personally, not by a form letter, but by a phone call from a member of Diana's direct team who said, "We are sorry this was ignored, and we are addressing it now." Some of those calls were hard. Some of the people they called had left the company. Some had moved on entirely and didn't want to revisit it. But the calls were made, and the record was corrected, and that, Diana had learned from her father, was the beginning of the only kind of trust that actually holds the kind, built on what you do when it's difficult, not on what you say when it's easy. The crew management process was rebuilt. A new protocol, formalized, documented, and named the Hayes Protocol, at the quiet insistence of the board, required that any complaint involving crew conduct be reviewed by an independent panel rather than passing through a single administrative gatekeeping function. No complaint could be reclassified as a non-conduct matter without the signatures of 2 independent panel members. Linda Marsh cooperated fully with the investigation. The records confirmed what Diana had noted in her file. Linda had been filing complaints about Holt's behavior for 6 years. All 3 had been suppressed by Brody. Whether Linda's silence on the morning of Flight 447 was fear or exhaustion, or simply the learned behavior of a person who had tried to do the right thing and been taught repeatedly that the system would not back her up. The investigation concluded that it was probably all three. She was reinstated, not to her previous role, but to a role with more authority and a direct line to the new compliance panel. She was also required to complete the ethics accountability program that Diana had commissioned for all senior crew members. Linda completed it and then asked to help teach it. She was the program's first guest instructor. Derek Walsh did not return. He submitted his resignation during the investigation period. Raymond Novak, the union representative, resigned from his position 6 weeks after the incident following an internal union vote of no confidence. 6 months after Flight 447, Diana Hayes was sitting in the left seat of a 787 on a morning run from London to New York. The sun was rising to the east, which meant it was rising ahead of her. The particular extraordinary reward of westbound transatlantic flight at sunrise, where the sun comes at you straight through the windscreen and turns everything gold for exactly the right amount of time. The flight was full. 280 passengers, same as always. Meals loaded, crew briefed, clearance confirmed. Sofia Garza appeared at the cockpit doorway. "Boarding complete, Captain," she said. "Passengers settled. Cabin crew ready." Diana looked up from the pre-departure checklist. She looked at Sofia for a moment. Sofia, who had stood up twice when no one else would, who had been threatened with her job and had said, "Go ahead," and had meant it. "Thank you, Sofia," Diana said. Sofia gave a small nod and disappeared back into the cabin. Diana looked out the windscreen at the runway stretching ahead and the sky above it and the light coming across the Atlantic in long, flat, golden sheets. And she thought about her father, about his hands over hers on the yoke of the Cessna, about the way the plane had vibrated against her small fingers, about everything he had meant when he said the plane talks to you. She put her hands on the controls. Thomas Holt had spent 32 years believing the cockpit was his, that the authority it conferred was his by virtue of time served and stripes worn that the people around him existed to confirm what he already knew, and that anyone who challenged his certainty was by definition wrong. He had never understood what the cockpit actually was, not a place that belonged to anyone but a responsibility that had to be earned every flight by the quality of your attention and the honesty of your judgment, and the willingness to listen, to the instruments, to the weather, to the people you were carrying, and to let what you heard change what you did. Diana Hayes had been listening her whole life. She released the parking brake. The 787 began to move smooth and certain toward the runway and the light. She had never taken the sky. She had simply always been the one qualified to fly it. The world had just needed 32 years and one very loud man in the wrong chair to finally understand that. If this story moved you, if you've ever been told you didn't belong somewhere you absolutely deserve to be, share it. Not just to spread a video, but because someone in your life right now needs to hear this story today. Hit the like button if Diana's quiet strength gave you chills, because that one small tap helps more people find stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories about people who were told they didn't belong and proved the whole world wrong. Ring the notification bell so you never miss one. We'll see you in the next story. All characters and events in this story are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental.